Hello, I'm Dr. Larissa Tracy, and welcome to Medieval Mischief and Mayhem. I am your host for this podcast, and like the Beowulf episode, this podcast is just me, so I apologize for not getting more guests in, but it's August, and that's when an awful lot of academics actually go on holiday or they're doing their research, so it's kind of hard to pin people down for interviews. But don't worry, we have some fascinating interviews coming up in upcoming episodes. But for this one, it's just me, and you may have figured out from my attire that this episode is going to be on witchcraft, or more correctly, dispelling the modern misconceptions about witches, witchcraft, medieval witchcraft, and talking about some of the most notorious episodes in history when it comes to accusations of maleficium. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with witchcraft, and I can't really imagine that anybody isn't familiar with witchcraft, it's important to identify what we mean by witch. Now, the word witch actually comes from Old English, Wicca. And Wicca, of course, has been adopted as kind of a generic term, or even in some cases a specific term, for modern neo-paganism. And it's important to note that while there is a very large contingent of modern witches who practice natural magic, both white magic and dark magic, and I'm going to talk about the differences between those things, modern witchcraft, as both a religious observance and as a practical application, doesn't actually have a direct trajectory and inheritance back to the European Middle Ages. And in fact, many Wiccans adopt in their practice a whole host of folklore and a whole host of different literary traditions and different traditions that survive in local landscapes and local communities. But there's not a straight line from the Middle Ages and medieval witches to today. Partly because, well, medieval witchcraft really wasn't a thing as we think of it. And that's an important distinction as well. So first of all, when we talk about witches, most people have in their mind the hats, the brooms. I don't have my broom up here. I do have a broom, because of course I do. If I could only make it fly, my life would be so much easier. But alas, I do not possess those powers. The stereotype of the witch with the hat and the pointy nose and a mouthful of sharp teeth, and I promise my teeth are not that sharp, that image actually comes from the late medieval, early modern depiction of the quote-unquote stereotypical witch that was popularized in a text that was printed in 1486. Called the Malleus Maleficarium. Now, the Malleus Maleficarium means the hammer of witches, and it was intended to essentially identify stereotypical witches. If you want to identify witches in your society, then get the Malleus Maleficarium and it'll tell you everything you need to know. The thing is that the Malleus Maleficarium is in many ways kind of an exhortation, an example of what's not a witch as much as what is a witch. Now, the Malleus Maleficarium is based in the Christian idea of consorting with Satan. And that's an important distinction because Satan doesn't actually really exist in any other tradition besides Christianity, not as we think of him as Prince of Darkness and all overriding evil. That's a Christian thing. In Judaism, there is an opposing force. Hasatan in Hebrew means the adversary. And in the book of Job, when God is even questioning himself whether or not his faithful are truly faithful, whether those who follow him and believe in him are faithful no matter what, partly because the adversary keeps asking him, are you sure? Are you positive? Are you 100% sure that your faithful are faithful all the time? Or are they only faithful when things are good? And if things are crap, are they suddenly going to shift and not believe in you anymore? And according to the book of Job, God goes, Good point. Okay. So my faithful guy Job that you just brought up, you can do whatever you want to him, just don't kill him and test his faith. So in the book of Job, it's actually God who sets the adversary to test Job's faith. And the adversary throws all kinds of things at Job. And they're not actually temptations, they are tests. And in the course of those tests, as Job is withstanding all of them, his faith remains intact and he questions different aspects of that suffering, but he never actually questions God. He has three friends who show up, and those three friends who show up say to him, well, what did you do? What did your family do? Or, this is just how it goes. And to each one of those questions, Job has an answer. And eventually, God shows up himself in a whirlwind. And I discussed this in one of the previous episodes of the podcast, because God shows up in a whirlwind and he questions Job himself. And Job is like, well, who am I to question? I have faith. The whole point of that story, though, is the introduction of the idea of an adversary. And I have said this before in other episodes. To the medieval mind, to the medieval Christian mind, having the belief in an entity that is equal to God, having an evil entity to the good entity that is meant to be God, is actually heretical. It is called Manichaean dualism. It is that dual nature that you have an equal and opposing force, good and evil. Now, at various times in the Middle Ages, this is doctrine and then it's not. Then it's heresy, then it's not. That is the nature of medieval Christianity. And I have said medieval Christianities plural, because Christianity in the Middle Ages is a constantly shifting thing. The Malleus Maleficarium actually represents that. When you get to the end of the Middle Ages, in 1486, when the Malleus Maleficarium appears, this image of what is good, what is evil, has shifted. Now, throughout the Middle Ages, the concept of a quote unquote witch really isn't a codified stereotypical thing. You have healers, you have people who do divination, though divination is a violation of the Bible. The Bible says don't divine. Soothsayers and diviners, Dante puts them further down in hell because it's seen as somehow usurping the power of God. If God is omniscient, if God is omnipotent, how can you possibly ask for guidance from another entity? And this would have applied to fortune tellers. This would have applied to soothsayers, to people who read tarot, to people who use different forms of divination to try and determine fortunes or fates or predict the future in any way. But that kind of divination was actually fairly common throughout medieval Europe. And you had a lot of people who engaged in folk magic. Now, magic is simply the idea that there are supernatural forces at work that can control or affect the way that the universe functions. You can have good magic and bad magic. That would be white magic and black magic. Now, as people manipulate magic or as people employ magic to sway other people, to influence the decisions of other people, a love spell, which, by the way, let me just put it this way. If you need to cast a spell on somebody to make them love you, don't do it. Because if they don't already love you, casting a spell is pointless. I mean, really, honestly, do you want somebody who had to be enjoined by magic? No. You want somebody who actually loves you in real life and fully. That's just my little romantic note for the side there. Don't use love spells, because even if they worked, why would you want them to? You want someone to love you for you, not because of magical intervention. But people believed in that. They believed in the possibility of magical intervention. And this idea that you could somehow petition the universe in some way or another to do your bidding or to do your will is fairly common in a lot of different societies. The belief in magic is actually foundational to societies all over the world and has been pretty much since people first came up with an explanation for something that they could not explain. Now, actually, I'm going to take the hat off because it's a little warm. It's still August. And since it is still August, it's warm. The hat's adorable though, and I love the hat. The hat, by the way, is from Dragon Wings LLC. They have a home spot at the Maryland Renaissance Festival. I'll include a link to their website on the YouTube page and Patreon pages. But seriously, Dragon Wings, their hats are phenomenal. But I digress into hats. Also, if you like my necklace, this is Dames a la Mode, and they make gorgeous reproduction historical jewelry that is very reasonable, and they have regular sales. I will also include the link for Dames a la Mode on the Patreon page. So, back to witches. This idea of being able to influence aspects, natural aspects of the universe is fairly common. It is actually a universal belief that there is something ineffable, that there are forces at work. And in so many ways, it's the foundation of religious practice. And you have the concept of people who can act within those powers, within that supernatural power all over the world. Now, in some cases, the designation of witch specifically, and it all depends on the language and the usage. In some cases, a witch is a bad thing only. A witch is somebody who manipulates the natural forces for ill in order to harm other people. In Native American traditions, in those of the Navajo and the Hopi, and in other indigenous nations, witches are bad, period, full stop, end of story. Witches, skinwalkers in Navajo tradition, use the elements and magic in order to do horrible things to other people. However, there's another side to that, because there are healers, shamans, medicine people who use magic for good. In some cultures, like indigenous North American cultures, you have the negative black magic side of that practiced by witches. And then you have the positive white magic side of that practiced by soothsayers or shamans, priests, or medicine men and medicine women. And that's an important distinction, because what one society means by saying witch is not necessarily what another society means when they say witch. You have shamans and priestesses. You have obeah in the Caribbean who commune with spirits, with loa in voodoo. You have people who actually channel through possession aspects of spirits. But that is not necessarily negative. That is not necessarily designed to cause harm to other people. That's an important distinction, because how you use the magic is as important as the magic you use. Now, underlying all of this is the belief in that magic. Because if you don't believe in it, what's the point? But in saying that, magic, miracles, they are pretty much two sides of the same coin, because what in one religious tradition may simply be seen as magical intervention is in Christianity seen as a miracle, because you're getting divine intervention. The only difference is you're getting the divine intervention of saints, if you're Catholic, or God, if you're not. And you have that capacity for divine intervention in most religions. It just takes different forms. So what a lot of people want to say as completely opposing ideas really are not opposing ideas. And I've said this before, and I will say it again, is that when you talk about mythology, one person's mythology is another person's religion, because at some point in time, if not currently, people believed in those ideas. So for centuries, all over the world, you have had people who believe in the efficacy of magical work, for good or for bad. Some traditions don't actually have black magic as part of what they do. They only see the use of natural magic as a good thing, as long as you are not trying to harm somebody else. And in modern Wicca and modern neo-pagan religions, in many respects, particularly in Wicca, the motto is, "An it harm none, do what thou will." In other words, don't hurt anybody else. Now, there are certainly modern Wiccan practitioners who work in darker magic. That is not something I traffic in because personally, I don't like the idea of doing harm to other people. There are people in this world that I think the world would be better off if they weren't around, but not my call and not something I would actively ever do. And honestly, for your own probably conscience and well-being, you shouldn't do it either. Just my own suggestion. I am absolutely 100% a practitioner of the "an it harm none, do what thou will." In that idea, people believed in spirits and forces all over Europe for centuries in the Middle Ages, and nobody cared. It was not actually seen as an opposition to medieval Christianity as it evolved. And in some respects, I mean, except for things like divination and soothsayers, you certainly have prohibitions against that in both Judaism and Islam. But again, you've got mysteries and miraculous events in both of those traditions too. And who is not to say that they are not some form of God-ordained magic? And so when we talk about the quote unquote witches of Europe, we're really not talking about the Middle Ages. There were occasionally moments in the medieval period, and of course we well define that medieval period. The medieval period, really, really honestly, is 476, fall of Rome, to the fall of Constantinople, 1453. Now you notice I said that the Malleus Maleficarum is 1486. In England, the Middle Ages probably went to about 1485 or 1509. So Malleus Maleficarum appears at the very tail end of the European Middle Ages. And that moment on the cusp of the Reformation is where you start to see people taking an avid and dedicated interest in defining people by good and by evil. Now, throughout the Middle Ages, plenty of people were accused of heresy. And witchcraft was considered a heresy. Especially as you get into the end of the Middle Ages, witchcraft is 100% considered a heresy because it violates the precept of Christianity. And heresy is people from within the religion holding beliefs that contradicted or were in contravention of regular orthodox religious belief. That heresy is heterodox belief. You're brought up in the Christian tradition, but your beliefs don't quite align. If you're not Christian, you can't be a heretic. Just like you can't be an apostate. An apostate is somebody who's Christian and then reverts to something else. And so in medieval Christianity, this idea of a witch was somebody who was using the precepts of Christianity, consorting with the devil, using miracles, magic, or magical implements, or articles and artifacts, or herb lore to harm others. If you weren't hurting other people, for the most part, nobody cared. It becomes a major issue, though, with the institutionalization of religion as part of state apparatuses. And that's particularly important in England, and it's particularly important after the Reformation. Now, that does not mean, like I said, that does not mean that there were not witch persecutions in the Middle Ages. There were people who went witch, and in a lot of cases, it was somebody who pissed off somebody else. And it might have been somebody on the outside of the community. It might have been somebody well-versed in herbal lore. But being well versed in herbal lore was actually kind of a necessity in a lot of localities in medieval Europe and, in fact, all over the world. You need to have your people who know medical lore, herbal lore, who are not the quote unquote learned, university educated physicians that we see coming up in the 12th century. These are your locals, and they were not all women. That is an important distinction to make. The assumption that somehow any witch craze was directed solely at women is a modern misconception. Not all witches were women. Not all witches were bad. In fact, the vast majority of them were not. The ones who get singled out generally get singled out because they do something that disrupts their local community. In 1996, Robin Briggs wrote a book called Witches and Neighbors, and he argues fairly convincingly that a lot of the accusations of witchcraft come from the proximity of people in villages who develop an issue, there's a problem, and people start pointing fingers. This is actually how a number of quote unquote witch crazes take hold. And it is a fundamental part of the Salem witch trials in 1692 in New England here in the US. And I'm going to put a pin in that because I will absolutely talk about Salem in a minute. But it's that accusations of your neighbors, of your locals, that really propels the persecution of individuals who are labeled witches. And it's a very convenient term to target people because it could mean any number of things. And so when fear and spite and competition, grievance, when local issues bubble up and people look for scapegoats, certain members of the community make very convenient scapegoats. And it wasn't always a charge of witchcraft. It might have been a charge of blood libel, which is one of the most hideous and insidious and inaccurate, fake, false, no other way to say it, it never happened, accusations against Jewish communities in Europe. The accusation that Jewish people killed Christian children, did weird things with their blood and the Eucharist, and were responsible for things like the plague. It's called a blood libel because it's a lie. That was not in any way grounded in fact. But much like witch trials that would target certain members of the community who might have in some way transgressed, Jewish people became convenient scapegoats. Witches became convenient scapegoats. But I will also point out that just because somebody was accused of being a witch did not mean that they were a witch. In fact, most people who are accused of witchcraft are not witches, not in any sense of the word, not reality, not natural magic, not healer, not somebody versed in lore. Chances are they are just somebody who falls afoul of somebody else. But an important component of those accusations is that people have to believe it. Not only do they have to believe that this person who probably lived among them for most of their life is capable of this harm, but they have to believe that the harm is possible. If you are cursing somebody, if you are using magical forces, potions, puppets, image magic, as it's called, and an image magic is essentially when you construct an artifact or a doll, a puppet, out of straw, out of cloth, out of clay, and you infuse with it certain characteristics of your target, hair, blood, skin, an article of their clothing, something that's been in close contact with them. If you take those things and you shape them into a form, and then you do things to that form, may sound familiar. I'm sure you all are thinking, ha ha ha, voodoo dolls. Yeah, a voodoo doll is one example. But did you know that image magic was actually fairly widespread in Europe throughout the Middle Ages? In fact, the chances are the reason it's a staple of voodoo, which is a syncretistic religion that combines Catholicism and West African juju among the enslaved population of Haiti and Dominica. And actually, in Dominica, it forms a Santeria, which is a particularly Spanish Catholicism mixed with indigenous traditions that create something new. Voodoo dolls is infused and influenced by the creation of puppets and image magic from medieval Europe. The Europeans probably brought it with them to the Caribbean, and then it mixes with the different traditions of African animism, and that's how we get voodoo dolls. So when people talk about things like voodoo and hoodoo, hoodoo is a variation of that practiced by the Gullah, often called the Gullah Geechee. They are the descendants of enslaved people, enslaved Africans on the islands off the coast of the Carolinas. And their belief system is somewhat similar to voodoo. All of those traditions are infused with both the animistic African traditions and indigenous traditions, as well as European Christian ideas, believe it or not. Now, some of those traditions survive in a variety of ways, and lots of people practice them. In fact, I don't think I have any more paint on my hands, but I just painted the gazebo on my back deck. I painted the ceiling a very light sky blue. It's called haint blue. And haint means haunts. And you will see throughout the American South, and in some places that are not quite so south. In Baltimore, you see it a lot. The ceilings of front porches are painted haint blue to ward off evil spirits. Now, the tradition is believed to originate among the Gullah Geechee on the Windward Islands and on the Seaward Islands and those islands off the coast of South Carolina and North Carolina. But obviously, enslaved African people who had this tradition among themselves didn't just invent it on their own. In some cases, that comes from African beliefs in warding off evil spirits, but in others, it mixes with European Christian traditions. Now, the idea of warding off evil spirits, and that's why I did it. I painted my gazebo ceiling blue. If I had a front porch, I'd have painted that blue the moment I moved in. Pray to all relevant deities and ward against all evil. Absolutely. It also has the added advantage of keeping wasps and other flying and boring insects from setting up nests in your eaves because it looks like the sky. And they think it's unsheltered, so they won't actually build their nests. So extra bonus, ward off evil spirits and wasps. But I say this because these customs are actually fairly well embedded into various aspects of American society. We don't even think about it. And in some cases, we do think about it, and we acknowledge its origins in both animistic traditions, but also medieval Christian traditions. Now, if you go back and watch my Halloween episode from last year, and I'll repost some of the advertisements for it. It was obviously October of last year. I talk about the way that Halloween is a syncretic tradition and holiday that mixes both non-Christian, pre-Christian Irish beliefs as well as Catholic beliefs into its own celebration. And in some cases, Dia de los Muertos, it mixes the Spanish indigenous beliefs. So this desire to see witchcraft as something other, as something dangerous, as something ulterior, really depends on your perspective. And as I said, witchcraft can mean harm to others, but in other cases it does not. In other cases, it simply means calling on natural forces or engaging in natural magic in order to do good. But it all depends on your perspective. Now, when we talk about the European witch trials, we are really only talking about 1450 to 1750. Now, that is well into the supposed Age of Enlightenment. And in fact, that's part of why it happens in the 18th century, is this desire to ferret out people who may possibly be doing harm by consorting with the devil. Now, this is a Christian ideology. Because in order to consort with the devil, you got to believe in him first. If you're going to be a Satanist, you have to be a Christian first. Because if you're not a Christian, you don't believe Satan has that kind of power. Just an important point to keep in mind. If you are a Satanist, well done. That's more or less a branch of Christianity. It's an inversion of it. There's a reason that certain modern Satanists hang their crosses upside down because they got a cross. It's an inversion of Christianity. It's not to mock it, because you do you, knock yourself out. I do know some Satanists. Nothing wrong with that. As long as you don't do any harm as far as I'm concerned, whatever floats your boat. But Satanism derives from Christianity. It derives from Christian theology. It derives from Christian interpretations of the Old Testament. It derives from Christian interpretations of scripture and actual theological practice. So in order to be a Satanist, you got to be a Christian first. Otherwise, you're not a Satanist, or it doesn't actually make any sense. Now, the witch trials from 1450 to 1750 relies on that belief in Satan. It relies on the possibility that there is an evil opposing force to the good force of God. And as I said, 1450, that's before the Malleus Maleficarum, but that's why they wrote it. That was why there was a need for it, was because you start to see people accused of consorting with the devil in the late 15th century. But an important facet of this, and an important misconception, is that everybody accused of witchcraft was executed. That isn't the case. It entirely depended on where you were. It entirely depended on the charges. It entirely depended on the harm you were supposed to have done. Now, in some cases, I won't call them witches. In some cases, people accused of witchcraft, because like I said, most of the people accused of witchcraft in the 1450s were not actually witches, not anything that we would recognize as witches. I mean, think about it. If you were an actual magical witch and you could actually control elements of nature, magic, if you could fly on a broom, would you really, really let them burn you at the stake? I wouldn't. If I had that kind of power, I'd zap their asses and we'd be done. I very much like the idea of practical magic. And Practical Magic 2 is coming out in September. But magic has consequences. And so if you're going to use magic, do so with forethought and consider the possible consequences before you do. Also, don't do bad things to other people. That's not cool. But in the Middle Ages, at the end of the Middle Ages, when there were all of these questions about the nature of Christianity, the whole question about consorting with familiars, those would be animals who act as if on cue, who act as your companion and in some cases your magical vessel, and in some cases as your conduit to worshiping Satan. I mean, Hellebore here might agree. She'd be like, I'm evil. She's not really, but you get the gist. Any kind of consorting with the devil, familiars, all of that stuff actually represents anxieties about the destabilization of Christian theology at the end of the Middle Ages. Because in 1486, when the Malleus Maleficarum is published, you're getting very close to the period of Reformation. And people had started to lose a certain amount of faith in the structures and institutions of Catholicism. The late 14th century really did a lot to shake people's faith, and there were reasons for that. In 1348, when the bubonic plague first hits Europe, over 6 million people die with that first wave of plague. And it could hit anybody. It didn't matter who you were. It didn't matter your status or your class. It didn't matter where you were. It decimated populations in Europe. And yes, some populations looked for scapegoats in Jewish communities. They blamed Jewish people incorrectly and wrongly for poisoning wells. That's not how you get the plague, but also the Jewish people didn't do that. They looked for people that they could blame because they didn't understand where it came from. And in some cases, they started targeting those members of society on the margins of society, male, female, people who might be querulous, people who might engage in magical healing, who might engage in divination, or who simply provided local medical care using herbs and everything that was available to them, as well as knowledge passed down for generations. Now, something like the plague starts to undermine that fabric where you believe in God, you believe that everything happens that is his will. Well, how do you follow through with that? I mean, there were an awful lot of people in the 14th century who were like, but either this is just our lot in life and we hate it and it sucks, or how on earth could a good and benevolent God do that to us? These become part of the questions. Now, of course, medieval Christians who believed that sin was their natural condition, and of course, any punishment was because of their sinful nature, they may not have questioned it. But not everybody believed that to the same degree. And in the 13th century, there'd been an entire extermination of people who held beliefs that were opposite or contradicted accepted orthodox beliefs. That's the Albigensian Crusade. From 1209 to 1229, the French authorities essentially wipe out as many people who believed differently as they could. The Cathars, the Waldensians, the Albigensians. These were all people who simply just didn't adhere to the orthodox view of the Eucharist as the literal body and blood of Christ. I've talked about this before. People who believed that they were perfect as they were, who didn't marry or didn't eat meat. There were all kinds of various theological beliefs that didn't gel with the accepted Catholic belief at the time. And I say at the time because the Catholic Church kept changing its mind. Couldn't agree on the color of shite for centuries. But when you take out people because their belief system is different, when you burn people at the stake as heretics, in some cases people went along with it. In some cases people were like, burn them, heretic, just don't burn me. Self-preservation actually ties into an awful lot of these heretic and witch crazes. People who really, really want to save their own bacon, and so they accuse other people. In some cases, they'll say, oh, I always thought that person, there was something shifty about them. Part of it taps into simply a social fear, the fear of people who could actually manipulate natural forces for malevolent purposes, the evil eye, or superstitions about needing to protect against evil spirits. Those persist. Those have always existed. Folklore is full of them. And folk practice still persists to this day. When I talk about Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and I talk about the pentangle, which, of course, if you put a circle around it, that's a pentagram, and people think it's a symbol of evil, it's actually not. A pentangle and a pentagram with a circle around it is a symbol of protection. It is meant to ward off evil spirits. So you'll find places in Eastern Europe that will actually put pentangles on the underside of pottery to protect it and to protect whomever uses it. A lot of that kind of warding magic was fairly common. But when you end up with people being executed for holding those beliefs, people start looking at their neighbors. And if somebody pisses you off enough, you may decide to actually accuse them of something that was impossible for them to have done. So in the 14th century, after the Albigensian Crusade, after so many of the Middle Eastern Crusades were unsuccessful, and pretty much all of them were, or if they were successful, it was only for like 100 years and that was it. When you start to see this question about religion, its efficacy, who's it working for, who's it working against, that is when you actually see the capacity for witch hunts. Now, the plague pushed that along. People start doubting Catholicism. Not only do they start doubting Catholicism because of the plague, you then have a schism where you've got two popes. Now, if the Pope is supposed to be God's representative on earth and you've got two of them, one in Rome and one in Avignon, what do you do with that? If the Pope is infallible, if he is literally God's direct representative and everything that comes out of his mouth is God's doctrine on earth, you can't have two of them. That further destabilizes people's belief systems in the institution of Catholicism. Not Catholicism itself necessarily, but it certainly destabilizes their belief in the institutions. Add to that local concerns, war, the 100 Years' War, which was mostly fought in bits and pieces in spurts every couple years, every 10 years or so, you had major siege battles. And if you lived in the locality like Poitiers or Crécy, you're affected by this. If you're in England, you may or may not be affected by it, but your husbands, your brothers, your uncles, your family members may be, because they may be the soldiers fighting in this war in France. When you have social upheaval in a variety of different ways, when you have inequality, when you have economic instability, when you have the formation of oligarchies or the abuse of oligarchies, where oligarchs control all the wealth and basically leave everybody else to suffer, that's when people start to question institutions. They question institutions of religion. They question institutions of law. When the law is turned against average people to their detriment, people will question it. All of these things, to an extent, are factors in the persecution of supposed witches at the end of the Middle Ages. And in 1517, when Martin Luther absolutely does not nail his 95 Theses, I only found out recently that that didn't really happen. I was so disappointed because I love that image. Yeah, didn't happen. But when he publishes his 95 arguments about the corruption of the Catholic Church, that was another thing. The Catholic Church was so corrupt in so many ways as an institution. You have simony, people selling religious office. You have nepotism, people putting their family members into higher positions of the church. Of course, that's going to undermine people's faith in the institution. And when you have monks like Martin Luther saying, fix this shit, and the church's response is, get the fuck out, and they excommunicate him, what's going to happen? In 1517, when he does that, he joins Jan Hus, John Calvin, and other people who dissented against the Catholic Church's totalitarianism and their authoritarianism, and they start to question the very precepts of biblical learning. So after 1517, when you have individual nations in Europe fracturing and following the new Protestant religion and rejecting Catholicism, now everybody's a heretic. And there's a counter-reformation where the Catholic Church doubles down. I have said this before, and in episodes discussing torture, this is a major facet of it. Torture really, really ramps up in Europe after the Reformation. It becomes a tool of the Counter-Reformation, of unstable religious authorities who were trying to reinforce their primacy by torturing people into confessing things that they did not do, could not have done, or if they did do them, it's not that big of a deal, like reading a book. Anne Askew was tortured during the reign of Henry VIII. She is tortured in England to confess to reading a book. Because you're not supposed to read religious books. You're not supposed to read the scripture for yourself. You're not supposed to read the scripture in anything but Latin if you can read it. Right. She was tortured, and then she was burned at the stake as a heretic. So a lot of what gets categorized as quote-unquote witch trials are actually heresy trials. Now, all of that said, in order for these charges to stick or make sense, you have to believe in them. You have to believe that they're possible. If you're like, I don't believe in witchcraft, that's bullshit. Then you're not going to accuse somebody of being a witch. And even if you do, then it's not going to do any good. If you don't actually tap into societal belief that something like this is possible, then it serves no purpose. But in many respects, it's grounded in the mostly Protestant, not exclusively, but the mostly Protestant version of Christianity that evolves after the Reformation. And as those Protestant sects, many of which believe in predestination, that if you are a well to do, vaunted member of society, it's because you are one of the elect, and you're one of the elect because you're predestined and you're already good, therefore you're already going to heaven. And it becomes a nice little self-fulfilling prophecy, but you're supposed to be good because you're already good. It's a circular argument as far as I'm concerned. That predestination, that's what they believe. You see that in Calvinism and in certain other Protestant sects. But Protestantism and all the denominations that come off of it, Lutheranism, Calvinism, even the Church of England, has this belief in both the capacity for sin and the possibility that the devil or Satan can lead people into temptation. It is the interpretation of the Old Testament as an act of temptation through original sin and weakness. Now, Catholicism has that too, but the Protestants double down on it, especially the Puritans. Now, the Puritans in England, they were originally a much smaller Protestant sect. Their beliefs were very much about the purity of religion. They did not believe in any art, iconography. They stripped their altars, their meeting houses, their essentially churches were bare. They didn't even believe in having, nice candlesticks on the altar, no trappings of any kind. It was supposed to be a purity of religion, purity of spiritual belief. It was meant to be the purity of the body, purity of the mind. All of it was meant to be very upright and proper. And many Puritans in England rather thought that everybody else should follow their version of Christianity. Now, at the time, at the end of the 16th century under Queen Elizabeth, and then under James, not their version of Protestantism. The absolute divine right of kings to rule in the monarchy is at odds with Puritanism. So a lot of Puritans were fined for not attending the official churches, the Church of England, which is Episcopalianism. They were prevented from freely practicing their religion as they wanted to, which meant proselytizing, which meant preaching to other people. And so an awful lot of them threw up their hands and left and came here in 1620. Now, 1620, James is king. This is only 9 years after James had the Bible retranslated as the King James Version of the Bible. And that becomes the official scriptural text of the Church of England. And that's produced in 1611. But of course, the Protestants did not actually adhere necessarily to that version of the Bible. There are other versions. There's the Geneva Bible that was produced by Calvinists who have a much more literal interpretation of scriptures, and the Puritans in many respects adhered to a more literal interpretation of scriptures. Now, in 1620, when they show up here, they land in Massachusetts, Plymouth. For those of you unfamiliar with American history, they are not the first colonists here. That's Jamestown. I say that as a Virginian. I say that as somebody whose mama's from Virginia. She's from Norfolk. And I say that as somebody who grew up and spent an awful lot of my time growing up in Virginia. The first American colony, or rather the first English colony in the Americas, is Jamestown, 1607, which was a purely economic endeavor. So for those of you who have heard or who argue that this nation is founded in Christianity, it is not. None of the founding fathers, except for one or two, considered themselves Christians. They were deists. They believed in God, but not necessarily the divinity of Christ. George Washington was not a Christian. He actually denied the divinity of Christ more than once. Thomas Jefferson, most definitely not a Christian. Believe in God, yes. So not an atheist, but not actually a Christian. Congregationalists were Christians, and of course John Adams was a Congregationalist, or he was Unitarian. There were some people who were Christian, but by and large, this country was not founded on Christian principles, and it was not founded with the intention of being a Christian nation. That is the entire purpose of the First Amendment, that says that the government of the United States shall make no law creating a national religion. I'm paraphrasing to a certain extent, but that's the point of the First Amendment. No institutional national religion, because England had done it. And the people who came here didn't want it, unless you were in Massachusetts. And the Puritans, the Pilgrims, when they show up in 1620, they establish a theocracy. Their government is a religious government. Now, that starts to fracture at the end of the 17th century. And in many respects, as the English king is asserting his primacy over the colonies more and more, he really wants to enforce the divine right and the royal right in opposition to the religious theocratic government of Massachusetts. And when he sends a new governor, the new governor actually does away with an awful lot of the much stricter Puritan beliefs and practices. And that Puritan ideology 100% believed in the devil, believed it was possible for the devil to possess people, for the devil to live among them. And that is why in February of 1692, the confession of an enslaved woman who was either of African descent or of Indian descent. The sources vary, and in fact, most of the contemporary sources and records record Tituba as having actually been Native American, not having been African, though she came to Massachusetts from Barbados with the man who enslaved her, Reverend Samuel Parris. That account that she gave in response to a bunch of girls who suddenly fell ill kicks off probably one of the most horrific episodes of violence, paranoia, and superstition in American history. In February 1692, a small select group of girls who had been practicing divination in December of 1691, they just wanted to practice divination. And it's not necessarily because Tituba had told them stories. Now, I'm going to cover this piece by piece. These girls, Betty Parris, Abigail Williams, and two of their friends, were cracking eggs into a glass to see what form the egg white or the egg yolk took in order to tell their fortune. Now, that's a fairly common form of easy divination that has roots in European folklore, in English folklore going way back. In fact, the magical divination of who am I going to marry? How long am I going to live? Let me read your palm. Let me play a game. Like in Ireland at the turn of the century, the turn of the 20th century, that's immortalized in James Joyce's story, The Dead, where on Halloween, someone's blindfolded and plates are placed in front of them, and plate that has water, earth, a ring, bread, and they move the plates around, and the person who's blindfolded has to put their hand on them, and depending on where they land their hand, that foretells their fortune in the next year. If you get dirt, it means death. If you get a ring, it means marriage. If you get water, it means you're going to emigrate. You're going to cross the water on a journey. Usually in that case in Ireland, it meant emigration. If you got bread, it meant you were going to be prosperous. Of course, that's divination. That's tell my fortune on plates. That is a common thing that still happens. When I lived in Ireland, my friend Aisling would make barmbrack cake and there was a ring in it. And if you got the ring, it meant that you were going to get married in the next year. I have like 4 of those rings. I've never been married, but I have 4 of the rings. So perhaps not the most reliable form of divination, but that kind of folk magic was pretty common. And it was common in Irish tradition, in English folklore. So the fact that these girls in December of 1691 are checking their fortunes by reading the egg yolk dropped into a cup is pretty standard. Nothing diabolical, but it's still divination. And like I said, all kinds of folkloric traditions about divination survived and came over either with immigrants or were amalgamations of a lot of different folklore that comes from local traditions, contact with the Native Americans, enslaved Africans, all these different traditions. But some of them just originated in Europe. They didn't have to come from African traditions or even Native American traditions. They were already part of English folklore. I mean, hell, my great grandmother's sister, Melissa, and that's with an A, was a witch. That was the common story, was that my great aunt Melissa was a witch in the Outer Banks of North Carolina, Nag's Head, that she would tell people's fortune by watching pennies chase each other in a cast iron skillet on the fire. You'd put 2 pennies into the cast iron skillet, you'd add a bit of water, and you'd watch how they skittered across the skillet because of the heat. And if you identified each of the pennies, you could tell somebody's fortune based on that. And we're talking the end of the 19th century here. We're talking end of the 19th, early 20th century, because this is my great grandmother's sister. Nobody said witch and did horrible things to her, but it was pretty well known and pretty well accepted that Aunt Melissa was a witch. So in that context, the girls who decide to check their fortunes by cracking those eggs into glasses and determining from the shape of the egg what their fortunes were was not necessarily dangerous, harmful, or even unheard of. But one of the girls, Betty Paris, Reverend Samuel Paris's daughter, she was 9. She thought she saw the shape of a coffin. And it freaked her out a little bit. You can understand that. You're 9. Not to mention, your father is a Puritan minister preaching every Sunday and pretty much every day about the presence of the devil among you. And what happens is those girls start to experience unexplainable things, pains, pinching, pins, needles, malaise, all kinds of things. And the first 4 girls, and it's Betty Paris, and then it's Abigail Williams, and then it's Ann Putnam and Elizabeth Hubbard. Those girls start experiencing these strange physical effects, and nobody knows what's wrong with them. Well, of course, the girls probably worked themselves up into a bit of a state about this. But because the Puritan people in Salem were willing to believe in the presence of the devil and believe in the efficacy of magic and the efficacy of maleficium, magic that causes harm to other people, people were willing to believe that potentially these girls were bewitched. Now, the first 4 girls, their reaction to this, to the divination, to the outcome, to the fortune that they told for themselves, has nothing to do with the enslaved woman Tituba. Nothing. Now, Tituba was enslaved in Reverend Paris's household, as I said, and he brought her with him from Barbados. And it's entirely possible that she was actually indigenous South American, Arawak, or there are other indigenous tribes to which she may have belonged. We don't actually know, but there are a lot of very plausible explanations for her origins. She was either born in Barbados, enslaved, or she was captured from South America, because that certainly happened, brought to Barbados, where Samuel Paris bought her. That's an important point. Tituba was enslaved, which meant that her entire well-being, her entire financial and subsistence and existence in Salem depended on Samuel Paris, who, from what I can tell, was a bit of a dick. Keep that in mind. But Tituba cared greatly about Betty Paris. And one of the townswomen in Salem, very concerned that they cannot figure out what is ailing these girls, asks Tituba and her husband, a man called Indian John, who was also enslaved and also Native American, Native South American. This woman, Mary Sibley, asks them to make a witch cake, asks them to create a cake to figure out who is afflicting these girls. And the idea of the witch cake is not to do harm, but as an act of white magic to find out who's bewitching the girls and stop them. Because by this point in February, the girls had been afflicted for about a month and a half, and people were worried about them. They didn't know what was wrong with them. But every day since the symptoms started, Samuel Parris was preaching and giving sermons about the devil among us, the devil among us, the devil's among us. If you do this, the devil's among us, the devil's among us. You might start to believe that too. And even if you believed it before, it was being pounded home constantly. And his 9-year-old daughter had to hear it every day. So she probably began to believe it. Whether or not her symptoms were psychosomatic, whether or not they were caused by kind of an anxious response to holy shit, we were casting divination and my dad is going to be so pissed, which is actually fairly likely. She's 9. She's probably freaking out that he might find out, because when he did find out, he was pissed. And this became a major facet in what happens next. So Mary Sibley convinces Tituba and Indian John to make a witch cake. Now, a witch cake, in this case, was a cake made of rye, so rye flour mixed with some of Betty Parris's urine and various other things, made into a cake and fed to a dog, with the idea that a dog could be a familiar and that the dog would reveal the witch who was bewitching her. It didn't really work, but Samuel Parris found out about it, and as convinced as he was in the presence of the devil among them, and also a bit pissed off at the village of Salem, because when they hired him as their reverend, as their preacher, their pastor, they didn't really want to hire him at first. He was not their first choice. They decided as a village not to pay him what previous pastors would have made in the locale. So Samuel Parris felt that he was getting short shrift from Salem to begin with. So he is preaching and preaching about the devil among them. He is preaching and preaching. I mean, at the end of the day, he is trying to create a climate where he is more necessary. And he has to justify what he wants them to pay him. And how do you do that if your entire job is based on a religious belief system and evidence that you cannot see? So when his daughter starts experiencing these symptoms, potentially out of anxiety of her father finding out that she and her friends were telling their own fortunes through egg yolks, he finds a convenient scapegoat. And when Mary Sibley convinces Tituba and Indian John to make this witch cake, and Samuel Parris finds out about it, he's furious. He is so angry. And there are records that he beat the crap out of Tituba. Now, there's an excellent book that was produced in 1996 by Elaine Breslau. It's called Tituba, Reluctant Witch of Salem. I will point out, though, it's 1996. So even though she acknowledges frequently in the book that Tituba is enslaved, she keeps referring to her as Parris's servant. Parris owned her. That is an important distinction. And as much as Breslau points out, well, enslaved people had certain rights under the law. Yeah, they did and they didn't. And at the end of the day, what was kind of unwritten and acknowledged was that Parris could do whatever he wanted to Tituba. And there's every suggestion that he did. In fact, there's every suggestion that he raped her, and that I won't call it a relationship. Some scholars have called it a relationship. You don't have a relationship with somebody who cannot consent. And enslaved people cannot consent because they do not have the power over their own bodies. That circumstance probably ended when he came to the United States, when he came to Massachusetts with Tituba and with Indian John. And it's entirely possible that he encouraged the marriage or promoted the marriage between his two enslaved people, specifically so that he, A, could deflect any responsibility. But of course, a lot of enslavers did it. So I'm not sure that anybody would have cared in Puritan Massachusetts in the 1690s. But regardless, Tituba was enslaved. And when Paris confronts her about the witch cake and beats her, she confesses and she names her accomplices, Sarah Osborne and Sarah Good. And it's actually Tituba's confession where she confesses to all manner of things that absolutely play into the Puritan fears about both Indians from the Indian Wars and King Philip's War that had happened a few years before. And of course, I will point out that while thousands of Puritans died in those wars, many more Indigenous people died as the Puritans took their land, burned their villages. Nathaniel Hawthorne in Young Goodman Brown refers to it, and he refers to it as an atrocity. And in fact, Young Goodman Brown, that he wrote in 1832, is a response to his family's culpability in the Salem witch trials, because his great-great-grandfather, John Hawthorne, was one of the court officials during the trial. And Nathaniel Hawthorne was so horrified by that legacy that he added a W to his name so that he could distance himself from that family heritage. And in Young Goodman Brown, he alludes to the fact that these supposedly godly people were more than happy to wipe out indigenous populations. So there were already Puritan fears at play before any of the girls experienced anything. Now, those 4 girls, they were experiencing what could easily have been attributed to anxiety about engaging in behavior that they knew was wrong, that had nothing to do with Tituba. There's no indication that she told them how to do it, showed them how to do it, though the story has evolved that she was telling stories of voodoo and she was an enslaved African woman from Haiti or Barbados. The 19th century mythology, and I fell prey to it. I mean, until I started doing more research on this, I believed it too, that she told them the stories and they went out dancing naked in the woods and drinking blood because they wanted to kind of enact the stories that Tituba told them. There's no evidence that Tituba told them those stories. But what we do have evidence of is Tituba's confession. And Tituba's confession plays right into those Puritan fears of both Indians, beliefs and cultures they didn't understand, and their very real fear of Satan and the possibility that Satan could influence or cause harm through the vehicle of witches. Paris beat her into that confession. We know that. It's part of the court record. But of course, she was enslaved. That wasn't a problem. When she confesses, she starts accusing other people. And that starts the ball rolling. And at that point, when she confesses and starts talking about meeting with the devil in the woods and consorting with him and Sabbats and a coven of witches in Salem, let me tell you, there are more witches in Salem now than there ever were in 1692. And the witches in Salem now are the good kind. From the time this starts, and actually it's not 12 months, from the time this starts, the very first accusations of witchcraft about others in February of 1692 to when it's finally stopped and the last execution happens in September of 1692 and the final people are let out of prison. Tituba is in prison for a longer period of time because Samuel Parris wouldn't pay to release her. I'll put a pin in that. That's 13 months. Tituba's in prison for 13 months. But the entirety of that whole scare, that whole process of accusation and trials and interrogations goes from about February 1692 until October 1692. Torture was part of this process. So you want to talk about American history. You want to talk about the righteousness of a country founded on the principles of Christianity. Bollocks. The Puritan authorities, who included men of God, reverends, magistrates, they tortured citizens in order to get them to confess to being a witch. Male, female, old, young, it didn't matter. They used stress positions, which means binding people in very uncomfortable positions for hours on end, forcing them to stand at length and not get any sleep. Sound familiar? Certain torture methods haven't actually evolved much. Pressing to death. Giles Corey refuses to confess to witchcraft. His wife, Martha Corey, had already been accused and she'd been executed. She's executed September 22nd. She's 72 years old and she is executed by hanging. But she'd already confessed to witchcraft. And if Giles Corey, when he's accused, if he had confessed, then his property would have been forfeit. And then his children could not have inherited anything. In fact, one of his sons is actually tortured into confession and ultimately does not confess. But Giles Corey refuses to confess because he doesn't want the government to get his property. He doesn't want the Massachusetts authority to get his property. So he refuses. And they increase the pressure in the act of torture. They have him lying on the ground. They put a plank of wood over him. And they pile it with heavy stones. And the idea is that it will start pressing on his lungs until he can't breathe. He refuses to confess. He refuses, and famously, he is said to have uttered as his last words, "More weight." And they put so much weight on him that he is crushed to death. Giles Corey is murdered through the application of torture. And he is not the only one who's tortured into a confession in the process of the Salem Witch trials. This is the most extensive recorded use of interrogatory torture in the American colonies. And it was deployed against all kinds of people on the accusation of witchcraft. And everybody who confessed to being a witch, which in many cases got them out of a death sentence, their property was confiscated. How many times in history has it happened that people are persecuted, specifically with the aim of relieving them of their property? We could have an entire episode just on that. 19 people are hanged as witches. Giles Corey is pressed to death. That's 20. And at least another 4 die in prison, awaiting trial, having been accused. Those people died because of other people's guilt, superstition, political ambitions, monetary gain, or self-preservation. When we think about the Salem witch trials, it is important to remember not the sensationalism of the trial itself and the accusations. I can promise you that none of those people were actually witches. There's no reason to believe that they were. Whether they had beliefs that deviated from strict Puritanism, it's possible. But the chances of any of them actually being malevolent witches, I'd say that's a 0% chance. But people were executed for this. Bridget Bishop, aged 60, executed by hanging. Sarah Good, age 39, executed by hanging. Rebecca Nurse, age 71, executed by hanging. Elizabeth Howe, age 57, executed by hanging. Susanna Martin, age 71, executed by hanging. Sarah Wilds, age 65, executed by hanging. Reverend George Burroughs, aged 42, executed by hanging. George Jacobs Sr., aged 83, executed by hanging. Martha Carrier, aged 49, executed by hanging. John Proctor, aged 59, executed by hanging. John Willard, aged 35, executed by hanging. Martha Corey, aged 72, executed by hanging. Mary Easty, aged 58, executed by hanging. Mary Parker, aged 55, executed by hanging. Alice Parker, she was executed by hanging, but we don't have her age. Anne Pudeator, age 70, executed by hanging. Wilmot Redd, executed by hanging. Margaret Scott, age 77, executed by hanging. Samuel Wardwell Sr., aged 49, executed by hanging. 19 people were hanged. Giles Corey, aged 81, pressed to death under interrogatory torture after he refused to confess. Anne Foster dies in prison. She is not executed, but she dies in prison. She is tortured and confesses, and her own daughter ends up providing evidence against her. But in order to save her daughter and granddaughter, she confesses. She dies in prison. Sarah Osborne, one of the first accused, actually dies in prison before they can hang her. She was 49. Lydia Dustin dies in 1693 after 11 months of imprisonment. She was acquitted, but she couldn't pay her court fees, so they left her in prison. Her daughters were arrested, and her granddaughter was supposed to be arrested, but she fled so that they could not. She was acquitted, but she died in prison because she couldn't pay her fees. Roger Toothaker, a doctor who died in a Boston jail after being charged with witchcraft. He was a practitioner of folk medicine, and he actually claimed to be an expert in detecting and punishing witches, but he is accused by proxy of being a witch, and he dies in prison. Mercy Good. When Sarah Good was imprisoned as one of the first accused with Tituba and Sarah Osborne, Sarah Good was pregnant. She gave birth in jail, and her infant child dies in prison before Sarah Good is then hanged. Rebecca Addington Chamberlain. She was arrested, and she was arrested on the suspicion of witchcraft. She was about 67, but she dies in prison. John Durant. Again, no court records about his arrest, but he was arrested and connected with the witch trials, and he dies in a Cambridge prison. A child, another infant, born to Elizabeth Scargan, who was imprisoned for witchcraft, dies because Elizabeth gives birth in jail, and the conditions of those jail were hideous, and that infant dies in prison. And as many as up to 13 additional people possibly died in prison, waiting trial or on charges of witchcraft. Elizabeth Proctor is sentenced to hang, but she is not executed because she was pregnant. Mary Osgood, age 55, living in Andover, was also sentenced, but not executed. I actually think it's important for you all to hear the names. If you go to Salem, there is a memorial to the people who were hanged and to Giles Corey, who died under torture. That is part of the legacy of this Christian heritage of this country. Fear and persecution are essentially what causes witch hunts. And of course, you hear the word witch hunt an awful lot in modern political parlance. People are like, witch hunt, witch hunt. Well, the idea of going after people, usually in a marginalized community, in order looking for scapegoats, okay, that's technically a witch hunt. But the idea of trying to accuse people of supernatural interference and causing other people harm is one rooted in local fear, local grudges, grievances, and religious zealotry. Religious zealotry is part of why the Salem witch trials happen. An enslaved woman is beaten into confessing a whole host of things that simply reinforce what the Puritans themselves wanted to believe. Samuel Parris probably bears more responsibility for the witch trials than any other person, and he eventually apologizes, but at that point, doesn't mean an awful lot. Tituba remains in prison for 13 months because Parris refused to pay for jail fees. You were responsible for your upkeep in prison, and you had a bill, and if you couldn't pay them, you weren't released, even if you were acquitted. The other thing is, though, is Tituba recants. Once the executions were stopped by the governor, Tituba, knowing that she now was not going to be executed, recants. She says, none of that's true. I lied because Samuel Parris beat me into confessing. As I said, that's how we know. Parris beat the enslaved Tituba to get her to confess to things she did not do. And feeling that she might now be safe from execution, she recants. And once she recants, an awful lot of other people recanted too, and recanted those confessions. They had confessed to save their lives. They had confessed in order to ideally protect themselves. Of course, in confessing, their property became forfeit to the government, and there are court records of people trying to get their property back. And in a lot of cases, they did. They got their property back. But they couldn't get their lives back. They couldn't get their loved ones back. Not the ones who were hanged, not the ones who were tortured, not the ones who die in prison. The PTSD that those people suffered after months and months in a crowded, squalid prison in Boston is unimaginable. Tituba is left in that situation because Parris refuses to pay for her to be released. He was furious when she recanted because, of course, it continued to make him look bad. He'd beaten her. As far as he was concerned, she was his property. He was allowed to do that. But in beating her into a confession, he creates the circumstances for this unimaginable atrocity that was upheld and perpetuated with full consent of the royal government, the local government, and the religious authorities in Salem and Boston. Nobody's hands are clean from the Salem witch trials. And eventually, somebody pays for Tituba to get out of prison by buying her. She is sold off to somebody else. We don't know who. She disappears from the written record at that point. It is important to remember that she was enslaved, that whatever she said or did under the fear of violence, of being sold away from her husband, Indian John, and possibly her daughter. There's a record of a Violet who lived in the Parris household who was also enslaved. This idea of the Puritan Christian morality creates the climate by which 19 people were hanged. One man pressed to death, and at least another 4 people die in prison on charges of witchcraft. Witches, as people think of them as malevolent entities, may exist. There are plenty of malevolent people, and if you ascribe to the practice of witchcraft, there are plenty of people who cast curses, who engage in spell work that may have malevolent intent. But most of the witches accused in the Middle Ages and the early modern period, and especially in Salem, were not witches. They were people. People who society saw as disposable, people who were easy to accuse, and people caught up in the petty machinations of neighbors and in the political schemes and religious authoritarian of other people more interested in their own self-preservation than the preservation of life. The history of witchcraft is a fascinating thing, and it means so many different things. But before you claim something is a witch hunt, perhaps consider the reality of who may or may not actually be a witch, and the implications that come from accusing people of things that there is no way they could have actually done them. So, I'm Dr. Larissa Tracy, and this is Medieval Mischief and Mayhem.